Hello, this is Donald Messer. I'll be doing the presentation over our paper topic. For my topic, I selected Maximilien Robespierre. What I really wanted to get into was his transition from his noble beginnings into him becoming a dictator. Most people today think of Robespierre as this maniacal dictator, just hell-bent on destroying the sanctity of France. Not so much so in the actual case, and that's what I really want to expand on during this presentation. And that's what I've expanded on in my paper as well. Uh, if we look at his importance, obviously Robespierre is one of the most important figures in all of the French Revolution, just as important in some instances as the king and or as Napoleon as well. Uh, Robespierre himself is going to, well, even though he's not ever technically the leader, he is going to be in the leadership positions, particularly with the Jacobins and a couple of other clubs, the Committee of Public Safety, and so on and so forth. But he is going to kind of be the main figurehead under this reign of terror, and that highly upsets the power dynamic between the people and the monarchy, completely abolishing the monarchy. And as you can see there, I've written that he starts off nobly and then eventually becomes what we would kind of call a dictator. Not necessarily specifically a dictator, but has similar elements to it. Now, if we look at the influences that really lead him down to this path, the death of his mother at age 6 is going to have a consequential impact, particularly on how he views education, particularly on what he wants to do with his life. The execution of King Louis XVI is really going to upset the power dynamic between the people and France as a whole. After Louis XVI is assassinated, very obviously you can't go back to a monarchy because, well, he's gone. And then finally, the death of Danton, I think, is going to highlight just sort of Robespierre's last transition into that dictatorial role. Danton was a fellow member of the Committee of Public Safety. He was a supporter of Robespierre. Him and Robespierre had uh, kind of started to establish some of the new rules for the Republic and started instilling some of those terror rules. But whenever he gets rid of Danton, that really kind of showcases that Robespierre has fallen from grace and is eventually going to lose his power and influence and his head by guillotine. So looking at the outline of the paper, the first part that I really go over is sort of the death of his mother and his experience at school. The second part that I delve into is kind of his time as a lawyer, how he makes a name for himself, what the Estates General is, why it gets called, and then, of course, as you can see here, I've got in quotations, incorruptible. So Robespierre was very devout to the revolution. He was very devout to Enlightenment ideas, going so far as to, well, literally kill tens of thousands of people to try to instill his version of the revolution. And then the third part there is him being the head of the Jacobins, which is the more extreme group in the National Assembly and then in the eventual Republic. The judge, jury, and executioner, where he is gone from this sort of enlightened idea man and now is restricting everybody's right to a fair trial, speedy trial, so on and so forth, and is becoming, well, the judge for all of that. And then lastly, the Festival of the Supreme Being. Now, in terms of its overall success, the people of France seem to thoroughly enjoy it. However, many of the leaders of the new republic saw this as sort of one of the final straws that they were going to let Robespierre get away with, and we'll explain that a bit further into the presentation. So I start the paper off by talking about the French Revolution. Anybody with any historical background should understand what the French Revolution is, its sort of impact. But as we know in the paper, we are going to put that it is a time of chaos, and then we transition into Robespierre, his reign of terror, and then finally his death. But the French Revolution is a time of turmoil. People are hungry. You have people of the Third Estate, the poor, the commoners, that are targeting the rich. They are targeting the priests and the First Estate, taking over all of their food and their supplies and their money. So it is just a time of utter chaos, and one of the few people that remain organized during this entire time is Robespierre. So that is one of the ways he is going to kind of gather a little bit of a following. Now, if we look at Robespierre's early life, his mother dying while he is 6 is probably the most impactful part of his childhood. After his mother's death, his father is going to go a bit kind of insane almost. He's very distant from the family. He only comes back periodically to get money. And then eventually he kind of just up and leaves, and they never hear from him again. But with Robespierre's mother's death, he is going to get heavily involved into education, eventually attending the College de Arras, or the college that was there at Arras, as a day boy. And what a day boy is someone who simply attends boarding school but goes back home at night. So he is not a resident of the boarding school, but does attend. Um, so he is going to be very successful in school, and eventually is going to earn himself a spot at the Collège Louis le Grand, where he is going to delve very deeply into the Enlightenment, particularly with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, really focusing on the social contract aspect of things, sort of what the people's responsibility is, what the monarchy's responsibility is, so on and so forth. And he really focused on the classics. And for our definition of the classics, that would be Latin and Greek. And as a matter of fact, he was such a great public speaker and was so successful during his time at the school, he was selected to do a speech for the king and queen after they visited for after their coronation. Now, the king and queen really did not give Robespierre any mind at all, but this is I wouldn't say a super impactful part of Robespierre, but I think it does kind of affect his views a bit more so, with the monarchy kind of showcasing that the monarchy see themselves as superior and not to pay any mind, um, relatively to the poor people. Now, after school, he is going to graduate and become a lawyer. One of the most interesting parts about Robespierre is just his devout work ethic. So in the span of 18 months, he got his bachelor's, and then he also got his license in 18 months as opposed to the regular 6 years. As a part of that, after he graduates, he's offered a position at the Parlement of Paris, which is one of the most influential law organizations, and they deal with all of the law in most of France and so on and so forth. But he winds up declining that and decides to go back to Arras to see his family and start kind of his own firm. And that is exactly what he does. During his time in Arras, that is where we are going to see him kind of make a name for himself, become a little bit successful, but never really kind of reach the upper echelon or the upper crust of society, but he is going to be a successful lawyer. Now, with his time in Arras, he is known for taking a whole bunch of cases and winning basically all of them. He becomes very well known, especially to the business owners and the more poor people out in the farmland. Now, with Robespierre being the person that he is, a man of the Enlightenment, he did not really woo many women, so he doesn't have any of those solid relationships that a lot of other leaders that do have, excuse me, that a lot of other leaders have, such as a King Louis or a Napoleon or so on and so forth. And he gets heavily invested into his work. There is a story from one of the sources I cannot recall right off the top of my head, but Robespierre had attended a party with his sister, and he was supposed to walk her back home, and wound up forgetting her there, and he just kind of up and left. But that really showcases kind of just the type of person that Robespierre is, and that really signifies sort of his devotion to his work. And because of this, and what I explained in the paper is because of his success as a lawyer, he's eventually going to be elected to be one of the representatives at the Estates General. And Robespierre goes on to be the, quote, defender of the interest of the countryside and of working people in the towns. So that is what he wanted to represent himself as. That is who is going to eventually control his election, and that's how he winds up there. And one of the things that really sets Robespierre apart is during the tennis court oath. So the tennis court oath, if you are unfamiliar, whoever is watching this, is going to be the time where all of the members of the Third Estate agree to keep meeting until the king basically signs a new constitution and makes them a constitutional monarchy. This is where Robespierre starts his transition into becoming the center of the revolution. I've got the quote here that Robespierre is going to say: "No authority is entitled to raise itself above a nation. No authority that emanates from the nation is entitled to censure. a constitution it gives to itself. This is where he really becomes the embodiment of the revolution, becomes kind of the incorruptible person that many people at this time are going to look up to him as. Another thing that Robespierre is going to really focus on is including all men in his ideas, in his speeches, not just kind of talking about, well, the upper crust or the bourgeois, such as the lawyers and doctors and so on and so forth, but also talking about the poor, talking about the slaves, wanting to implement rights for them, those natural rights back to the Enlightenment. So during his time with the tennis court oath and the kind of the early parts of them establishing a new government, he creates a little bit of a following around himself and becomes involved with the Jacobins, which are going to eventually become kind of the more radical group, and they are the ones who are going to be promoting the overthrow of the king and the violence and so on and so forth. And that's what is explained in the paper. With his involvement in the Jacobins, this is where we really start to see Robespierre start to don a new type of persona, utilizing terror and violence as opposed to kind of the common Enlightenment idea. So we are going to see him start kind of going against what his own ideas are in order to keep the revolution moving forward. One of the big parts of this is whenever they remove the king from power, they make him into just a regular citizen, Louis Capet, and then eventually they're going to have him tried and charged with treason and conspiracy against the government. And then, of course, as we know, Louis XVI will be eventually executed. Really upsetting. Really upsetting the power dynamic. Now, if we look at how Robespierre is really going to gain power, I've identified three things here, particularly the lack of food, the needs of the people. So Robespierre is in a bit of a dynamic position at this point. He always wanted to address what the people needed, particularly food, and then, of course, things like representation, things like rights, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be one of the few things that allows Robespierre to sort of maintain his organization and create that bigger bit of a following. Number two here is the impending war with Austria. So Marie Antoinette is of the Austrian bloodline. She was a princess there. And obviously, as a result of the execution and them just taking King Louis XVI out of his royal position, out of the monarchy, Austria is eventually going to declare war with France, and people are panicking over that. And then, of course, one of the final things that is going to allow Robespierre to really gain power and maintain it is this use of violence to quell all of these rebellions, to get rid of these people who are against the revolution, these conspirators, and so on and so forth. And that's what's sort of explained there in that section of the paper. Now, with the creation of the Committee of Public Safety, this is where we see Georges Danton and also Robespierre create this committee. And the main focus of this was not only to protect France, but also to kind of figure out who those counter-revolutionaries are, particularly people like King Louis XVI or Louis Capet, people like Marie Antoinette, or people that are eventually going to have, well, themselves betrayed by the own committee, people like Danton or Desmoulins. And terror becomes the way that they rule. Danton has a very famous quote here saying that the committee must be terrible in order to prevent the people from being terrible. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation when you think of it that way. The committee is being exponentially worse than the people in an effort to quell these rebellions and in an effort to restore order to this chaos that they have created by getting rid of the monarchy. So continuing on here, the next section of the paper really looks at the Reign of Terror. What is this Reign of Terror? And this is where Robespierre's ideas and sort of his actions really split apart here. His ideas are that of somebody who is enlightened. His ideas are that of somebody who focuses on what the needs for the people are, what would benefit the people, and so on and so forth. But the actions he is taking to keep the revolution going, for lack of better words, is kind of asinine. He's using the guillotine. He is instilling fear into people. And again, kind of referring back to our previous slides, he's incorruptible, not allowing anyone to sway him from the revolution, but at the same time, his version of what the revolution is and how to achieve the revolution has become very skewed. It's almost like he's lost his sense of direction, and that's what Desmoulins is going to kind of point out to him before Desmoulins is put on to death. And Desmoulins is going to call Robespierre a hypocrite. No longer is he invoking the rights of people like Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire. Uh, Robespierre has become kind of this maniacal dictator. He's the judge, the jury, the executioner. He is having people killed for doing basically nothing, just people that he deems as enemies of the revolution, those counter-revolutionaries. And then eventually having Desmoulins and Danton both killed really shows his split between those actions and his ideas. Desmoulins was a very dear friend of Robespierre's. Um, and in my paper, I also kind of identify that after Desmoulins dies, Robespierre takes a bit of time to reflect. He becomes very distant from what he was. And I think this is where we really see that transition, that Robespierre is understanding that he kind of has become a dictator. He has become the exact opposite of what he wanted to do regarding the revolution. Now, if we look at the Festival of the Supreme Being, for a lot of the leaders of the New Republic, this is sort of the final straw. They convert to a brand new calendar. They try to instill all of the ideas of Catholicism without Christ as the head. Instead, Robespierre is the head. And what this supreme being is supposed to be is sort of the embodiment of the Enlightenment, sort of the soul of the Enlightenment. Now, according to one of my sources, the people found solace in the festival. They thoroughly enjoyed it. So all across France, people were rejoicing with this supreme being, kind of buying into the idea, utilizing the calendar. But for the most part, the people in Paris, the New Republic, and those leaders are completely against it. And a lot of their contemporaries who are going to write about Robespierre and vilify him, this is going to be one of the things that they focus on. Getting rid of Christianity and replacing it with some new fashion religion that doesn't necessarily reflect what France wants. And then, of course, with the final bit of the paper before my conclusion, we have Robespierre's death. So he's going to threaten other leaders with a quote-unquote list of people who he deems to be a threat to the revolution. The next day before Robespierre even comes into the court, they have all banded together and they convict Robespierre of crimes against the revolution before he can use his list. And as a result of that, Robespierre is going to wind up trying to kill himself and has a failed suicide attempt. Now, supposedly, this is from a sporadic gunshot either by himself or he catches kind of a stray bullet in one of the, in one of the, well, he catches a stray bullet either by shooting himself or he catches it whenever they are trying to capture him. But regardless, he is going to have his jaw destroyed, and the doctor is going to kind of just stitch him up a little bit and hold his jaw together with a piece of cloth. And that eventually leads into, kind of his legacy. So after the guillotine comes down on his neck, that same guillotine that had killed over 10,000 people is the same one, the same machine that is going to kill Robespierre. Now, with my research and kind of what I've stated in the paper, if you look at Robespierre as an entire character, and obviously today he is seen as one of the most evil men, especially during the French Revolution, but if you look at his transcension, Robespierre kind of just loses his way. He wants the revolution to keep progressing. He wants Enlightenment ideas to be the main benefactor of the French Revolution. However, the way that he does it, especially utilizing violence and utilizing the guillotine to control people, goes completely against what Robespierre was going for. He was a firm advocate for getting rid of the death penalty. He didn't want to go to war. He didn't want to use the death penalty. But as the revolution progresses and he sees that violence is the way to control people, in his own mind, he sees this as him being virtuous and trying to get the revolution together as quickly as possible. So with his legacy, obviously today he is seen as kind of one of the most evil men. Realistically, though, I don't think he was intentionally that evil. But yeah, I mean, he still becomes a dictator, right? And then, of course, for my last couple of slides here, we have just the bibliographies of some of my resources just right there. And that's